Hello, my name is Terry Morgan, and I'm the CEO and founder of Rise for Tomorrow, where we look to improve teacher practice and also student outcomes. Of the many areas that we look to improve what teachers do in the classroom, one of the most critical areas that we focus on is the use of classroom formative assessment. Because one-size-fits-all instruction does not work for diverse learners, the significance and the use of formative assessment can never be overstated. To improve how adaptive teachers are, I believe it is critical that we have a much deeper understanding of the factors that contribute to the overall effectiveness of formative assessment. Now, to gain a much deeper insight, much deeper comprehensive understanding of how to use formative assessment to truly unlock students' potential, we need look no further than a common field trip. I call this the field trip analogy. And within this analogy, I hope that you are able to gain insight on the key factors that can contribute to improving your use of formative assessment as early as tomorrow. Enjoy.
My first year of teaching, I taught marine science. Part of the curriculum recommended that students encounter real-world examples of the content, so we planned a trip to SeaWorld. Although I had visited SeaWorld before, this was my first time going as a teacher. Many things go through your mind as you prepare for a field trip to SeaWorld. As a first-year teacher, on my very first field trip, if I may be honest, my main concern wasn't inspiring future marine biologists. It was simply to not lose any of the students on the field trip. That's it. After a restless night, I arrived at the school determined to have a successful day. Success that day had nothing to do with having fun or even learning. My mind was fixed on bringing every student back. Right before we left, I counted every single student on the bus. I had exactly 25 students. After a quick recount, we took off. After a couple of hours of driving and a couple stops for the bathroom and for food, we arrived at SeaWorld. Stepping off the bus, my game face was on. I told myself no one would get lost today. We started the day off with some exhibits and then moved to the roller coasters. Each hour that passed without a noticeable incident elevated my confidence, and as the day progressed, I began to relax and even have a little fun. I got so caught up in the fun that I almost didn't realize it was time to leave. My group of students made our way back to the bus and we headed home. As I sat there on the bus, a smile came across my face. I survived my first field trip as a teacher. I felt accomplished. After a quick stop for dinner, we made it back to the school. The driver parked the bus and the students prepared to get off. As the students exited, I began to count to confirm that I had the same 25 students. 1, 2, 3, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Uh-oh. Only 20 kids got off. I quickly jumped on the bus and saw no one there. I ran down the aisles to see if anyone had fallen asleep. I checked the bathrooms. No one was on the bus. My heart immediately sank. I had lost 5 students. The more I repeated it, the worse the realization set in. I left that morning at 6 a.m. with 25 students, and now, at 10 p.m., I only had 20. How could this happen? I thought that all of the students were with me the entire time. At that point, I realized I had 2 problems. First off,
at this point in our story, you may have noticed that the teacher has 2 major problems. Well, I would say 5. You consider the 5 kids that she's lost. But what are the 2 major problems that the teacher speaks of? And perhaps, how could they have been prevented? Think about it. Let's get back to our story.
At that point, I realized I had 2 problems. For starters, I had lost some students. That was obvious. But secondly, and perhaps scarier, I had no idea where I lost them. They could be anywhere. I started to consider each moment of the day and where I might have lost them. I recall that we first stopped at a rest stop an hour into the trip. Some students got off the bus, some students got back on the bus. I could have left them there. Then I remembered that we also stopped for breakfast shortly after. Kids got off to eat, kids got back on. I could have left them there. As I continued to retrace my steps, I realized that once we arrived at SeaWorld, we visited what seemed like countless exhibits and rides. I could have left them at any one of them. I then considered the drive home and the stop for dinner. I could have left the students at the restaurant. Because I had no idea where the students were, I realized that I would have to backtrack to each and every critical point of the trip to hopefully recoup the students that were lost. As you might guess, attempting to locate the lost students would cause a great deal of stress and anxiety. Interestingly enough, the same anxiety and stress I experienced that day, I have grown to learn is not unique to teachers only on field trips. Many teachers have shared the same feelings of losing students, not on a field trip like me, but rather in a classroom. In fact, if you think about it, monitoring students on a field trip is very similar to using formative assessment during a classroom lesson. For starters, I approached the field trip with a goal. Teachers begin lessons in a similar fashion. My goal was to not lose any students on the field trip. And although teachers use standards to identify academic expectations, underneath their learning outcome, they have the very same goal as I, to not lose a student on the field trip of learning. After identifying the goal, teachers begin to teach and create experiences for students. Typically, towards the end of the lesson, the teachers engage students in an assessment to verify learning, or in other words, check to see if they are still with them. Whether teachers use exit tickets, performance tasks, or another technique, the goal is to verify that the students are still with the teacher. When teachers review the data from the assessments, which typically occurs after the lesson has concluded, they often realize that they have the same two problems I had on my field trip. They lost students, and they don't know where they lost them. Throughout the lesson, the teacher may have provided direct instruction, require students to copy notes, read, talk to peers, or even watch videos to support learning. Like the field trip, the students could have gotten lost at any point throughout the lesson. Perhaps students may have gotten lost when the teacher explained the third step of the algorithm, or maybe it was when the teacher shifted instruction from identifying the point of view to requiring students to analyze how an author develops it. To locate students lost on the field trip, I had to backtrack and consider each critical point of the day. For teachers, locating students lost on the field trip of learning is done in the same way, backtracking, but manifests itself as reteaching or intervention, which most often occurs right before high-stake testing. If we think back to the field trip and consider what I could have done to reduce the probability of losing a student, we see that the same approach is applicable to the classrooms and the use of formative assessment. For starters, unlike myself on the day of the field trip, effective teachers constantly do head counts at key transitional points throughout the entirety of the field trip. I realized I should have consistently checked to see if my kids were with me when we stopped at the rest stop, when we stopped for breakfast, when we moved from one exhibit to the next at SeaWorld, before we left SeaWorld, and when we stopped for dinner on the way home. Each key moment provided an opportunity to verify if the students were still with me, and if they weren't, then the ability to make some real-time decisions to attempt to get them back. This is no different than stopping at key points during a lesson to ensure that students are still with the teacher. Checking on students only at the beginning and at the end, whether on a field trip or in the classroom, increases the probability that a student may become lost. In fact, if students get lost in the early stages of a lesson and it is not revealed until much later, supporting the students becomes more difficult, as is maintaining their engagement and motivation to learn. Consider for a moment if I had lost a student at the first rest stop, 45 minutes into our trip, and I didn't find out about it until I got back to the school that evening. Recouping the student becomes more difficult the longer I go without knowing. Checking to see if students are still with us should be a routine occurrence, whether on a field trip or in a classroom. This demonstrates a powerful connection between what good teachers do on field trips and how effective teachers use formative assessment in classrooms. In either case, relentless inspection is vital. A very easy way to consider this is, the higher the frequency of checks, the lower the probability of losing a student. The converse is also true. The lower the frequency of checks, the greater the probability of losing a student. Yet, maintaining relentless inspection is not the only aspect that connects field trips and classroom instruction and formative assessment.
At this point, we've identified our first analogous correlation between a field trip and how we operate in the classroom with using formative assessment. checking on the kids at the beginning of the lesson, at the end of the lesson, still allows us to use formative assessment. I can take that data home and I can use it the very next day. However, the impact will not be as great as it would have been had I been checking consistently within the lesson. So our first connection, relentless inspection, stopping at key points, key teaching points along the way, provides us more impact in terms of moving kids further along. Yet, that's not the only correlation between classroom formative assessment and how we operate on field trips. What else can you think of that connects formative assessment and classroom field trips with respect to how teachers check on students? Think about it. Now let's get back to our story.
Consider for a moment, when teachers on field trips check to see if students are still with them, how many do they check on? The obvious answer here is all of them. It would seem careless to only verify that some of the students are still present and accounted for. When teachers check to see if all students are accounted for on a field trip, it typically includes a teacher retrieving a roster, the teacher saying every student's name and the student affirming that they are there. Effective teachers would never only ask for only some students to speak up. They ask for all. Can you picture me on my trips to SeaWorld about to leave a rest stop, pulling out my roster, only asking for the first student on the list to affirm that they are present, and then sitting down and telling the driver it's okay to leave? I suspect teachers would never do this on a field trip. However, it can be common practice in classrooms. During a lesson, teachers engaged in a teaching point may stop to ask a question to ensure students have processed the information. The teacher begins by asking a question and prompting students to raise their hands to answer. A few students raise their hand, and then the teacher calls on one of them. If the student responds correctly, the teacher may say, "Terrific, let's move on." In essence, one could say that the teacher was on a field trip of learning, arrived at a transitional or key point, affirmed that at least one student was still with her, and then decided to move on. Raising hands, which is one of the most common methods of monitoring learning within a lesson, greatly increases the probability of losing students, particularly when it is used routinely and engages the same students throughout the lesson. This is because techniques such as raising hands does not ensure high active engagement or sample size. If a teacher has 25 students on a field trip, the goal is to know where all 25 of them are minute to minute. And while this is common practice on field trips, it may not be in classrooms, where it is much more difficult to keep students with us. Because learning is not the consequence of teaching, it is the consequence of thinking. Simply because a teacher teaches does not mean the student will learn the desired content. Understanding the connections between a field trip, classroom lessons, and formative assessment allows us to highlight key factors such as frequency and active engagement. How often we check and how many students we check on greatly impacts the success of a field trip and the use of formative assessment within a lesson.
And there you have it. The teacher identifies the second correlation between classroom formative assessment and going on a field trip. Not only is the frequency critical in terms of ensuring that we're constantly collecting data from our students, but also the sample size, or what I'd like to call active engagement. How many kids you collect evidence from determines the impact of your formative assessment use. Now, keep in mind, if a teacher uses a technique like raising hands, they're still able to navigate the formative process. There's an evaluation, and there could also be a response to that evaluation. However, when that sample size is much greater, the impact of that formative assessment process could be so much more impactful in regards to more diverse learners in the classroom. Even the smallest adjustments, switching out one technique for another, could have the greatest impact on learning, shifting the trajectory on student success in your classroom. Classrooms that often appear in need of Herculean efforts to improve student practice can often be improved by simply elevating the frequency of formative assessment use and also the sample size in which we're using the formative process. The minute-to-minute decisions that we make drive our student success. It impacts the trajectory of what students can do and learn in that classroom. What we must understand is that although the material has been delivered, and perhaps in our mind, delivered very, very effectively, it does not mean that the students have learned. Learning is not the consequence of teaching. Learning is the consequence of thinking. And although we create thinking, it does not always lead to the desired student learning. The goal here in regards to teaching is not to be perfect. If in fact you do finish that lesson and you still only have 20 kids with you, perhaps 5 have gotten lost, the goal here is to ensure that you know exactly where those students got lost. Formative assessment can be used to impact success in varying degrees. Simply because we're using it does not mean it's going to have the impact that we seek. There are key factors that determine our overall effectiveness in the impact of formative assessment. Frequency, sample size are 2 key ingredients to elevate classroom practice and use of formative assessment. Consider to yourself as you're moving through your lesson, do I know where my kids are on this field trip of learning? Thank you. And that is the field trip analogy. For more tips on how to improve classroom formative assessment, classroom practice, visit risefortomorrow.com or email me at terry.morgan@risefortomorrow.com.